Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining. We'll be having a webinar and panel discussion today about the Biden administration environmental justice priorities and integrating the National Environmental Policy Act, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, and community outreach. For folks who have joined us, we are recording this webinar, and that recording will be sent as a link to all of the attendees after this meeting, and it will also be posted on swca.com. Please note that all of your microphones are muted, and the chat feature has been disabled. However, we do welcome your questions, and we ask that you submit your questions using the Q&A function in the Zoom toolbar. We will be trying to set aside enough time at the end to answer some of the questions that you submit. However, due to the high number of attendees, we may not get to all your questions, but one of us will follow up with you after this webinar. Next up, I just want to introduce our panelists. So Matt, Petersen, and I will be moderating this panel. We have Jim Stobaugh, who's recently joined SWCA after a long career with the BLM. Scott Phillips, who's about to celebrate his 20-year anniversary with SWCA, and he's the Cultural Resources Technical Director. Meg Perry is an expert environmental facilitator with SWCA. And then we're delighted to have Joy Huntington. She's the president and principal of Ukukti Consulting. As I said, Matt and I will be moderating this panel, and I'm going to let Matt walk you through our agenda.
So today we want to cover some of the big changes that we've seen that the Biden administration has done related to NEPA, and specifically those changes that are connected with some of the recent executive orders regarding environmental justice and climate and the link therein. And we also want to cover what that means potentially for future projects down the line, and best practices for community outreach to best meet the requirements for these priorities and ensure that any sort of output, particularly NEPA, is something that not only addresses those priorities, but also is defensible and robust. We're going to follow that with a panel discussion with some pre-prepared questions, and then a Q&A session. So I want to start off and talk broad scale about these administration priorities that we're seeing. As everyone I'm sure is aware of, we've seen a flurry of executive orders and secretarial orders coming out. We've seen appointee appointments that shows a new priority on climate change and environmental justice, and a focus on science in terms of assessing the impacts of these things and in NEPA in general. And I think that this has been very much illustrated with how the current administration is already doing its staffing and leadership out there. These three ways of addressing these priorities are typically what you see, and that is how staffing is picked. And we've already seen on the appointments at the departmental and agency level that they're very serious about this. Funding is also a factor, and of course the policy. And we're going to talk more on the policy side today and what that means. At this point, I would also want to emphasize, as Jim will start talking about these executive orders as secretarial orders, is looking for the fact that we have a very, very strong link with these executive orders between climate and the impacts of climate, and that linked with environmental justice. I think that's very important for consideration in this whole discussion, is that we have an overt link between climate as an environmental justice issue. Now, usually you see a certain pattern for how an administration implements its policy, right? And I think more and more we're seeing that pattern because, for lack of a better term, the partisanship that there's been out there with regards to policy, we're seeing that pattern even more strongly implemented. And that is executive orders that are put out there to establish, like, this is what we're going to be doing during this administration related. This is how we're going to implement existing regulatory processes, because a lot of times, particularly with NEPA, those processes have enough ambiguity that it allows an administration to put their stamp on that. And that's what those executive orders are, the first step. And then that goes to the departmental orders, where you see the secretarial orders, like we're seeing here, and that we saw in our last administration, a whole flurry of those. And then at the agency level, you get instructional memorandums, which are meant to be basically preliminary, temporary guidance that are then followed by departmental handbooks and departmental guidance. And in a classic example we saw between the Obama and the Trump administration was related to mitigation, right? Executive orders related to mitigation and no net loss, then departmental secretarial orders on, okay, this is what you're going to do, it's compensatory, and then agency guidance under an IM, followed by agency guidance with a handbook, for example, BLM, on mitigation, how to do it. One of the issues that we're having now with this quick switch in 4 years is we're seeing a lot more of this done through the executive, departmental, and preliminary instruction memorandums, and we're not getting to the point where we're actually seeing that regulatory guidance develop, because it's been switching so quickly, which means we need to give pay a lot of attention to those secretarial orders and those preliminary instruction memorandums, because they're the ones that are going to be making the changes in how we do things.
Thanks, Matt. And like you said, I know Jim will be talking about some of those executive and secretarial orders. And just one thing to note, at least with this administration, we're not yet seeing a lot of those instruction memos out. So that's why you see to be determined up here. We're kind of waiting to see how some of the agencies interpret executive and then departmental guidance. So more to come on that for sure.
So one of the things that we want to emphasize too is we're seeing a lot of regulatory actions happening very quickly, and today we're focusing on a couple of those, but there's a lot of potential changes out there, and as Kara pointed out, there's a lot of guidance still pending. The ones right now, for the purposes of our discussion, that we're concentrating on is one, what this means for the National Environmental Policy Act, and more specifically the link of that with climate. We know, for example, that one of these regulatory actions already rescinded the 2019 draft guidance for the analysis of climate and put us back to the 2016 guidance that was developed under the Obama administration. And so we're basically seeing a lot of reset with these regulatory actions back to a lot of the things that we were seeing under the Obama administration.
All right, thanks, Matt. Jim, why don't you walk us through some of these executive and secretarial orders, and at least the prominent ones as it relates to this administration and environmental justice.
Let me get myself off mute. Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Stobaugh. Yes, and we want to continue the discussion on how the permitting landscape and the agencies may be changing and reacting to the priorities and administrative actions of the Biden administration. My emphasis will be on consultation, and Matt and Kara have kind of set up a lot of the discussions I'm going to be covering here. On day one, Executive Order 13990, titled Protecting Public Health and Environment and Restoring Science to Tackle Climate Crisis, was signed by President Biden. As most may assume, day one executive orders set the expectations and the tone of the administration. As you may see here on the second bullet, immediately commence work to confront the climate crisis, as Matt was discussing just moments ago. Section 1 out of that executive order was the policy statement, and the administration's policy, I'm just going to hit the highlight key words out of that policy statement. Listen to science, improve public health and protect our environment, ensure access to clean air and water, limit exposure to chemicals and pesticides, hold polluters accountable, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, bolster resilience to climate change, restore and expand national monuments, prioritize environmental justice. So those are I'd say the key words out of that policy that we'll be discussing, and you'll be seeing a lot more emphasis of. Section 2 of that same executive order said immediate review of agency actions taken between January 20th, 2017 and January 20th, 2021. Wonder why they picked those time periods. I think as Matt discussed a while ago or suggested, there's a reset going on right now. Under Part E of that section, it's in carrying out the actions directed by this section, heads of agencies shall seek input from the public and stakeholders, as it shows here on this slide. That's going to include state and local, tribal and territorial officials, scientists, environmental advocates, environmental justice organizations. In a recent Law 360 article published only May 27th, it stated, EPA and other federal agencies will likely increase outreach to environmental justice communities, thus giving those communities more influence over federal environmental policy. Next slide, please. Under the new Interior Secretary, Executive Order 13175, which is titled Consultation and Coordination with Indian Tribal Governments, signed in 2000, is going to be reemphasized. As it shows on the slide, this executive order reaffirms the federal government's commitment to tribal sovereignty, self-determination, and self-government. Its purpose is to ensure that all executive departments and agencies consult with Indian tribes and respect tribal sovereignty as they develop policy on issues that impact the Indian communities. Government-to-government consultation is not just an analogy of cultural resources and/or traditional cultural properties. Tribal consultation under Section 106 is intended to discuss the health and the well-being of the tribes as stakeholders, and as this executive order emphasizes, as sovereign nations. Tribes often want to discuss land use, riparian areas, water conservation, fishing and hunting, access. Under Section 5 of this same executive order, it states that each agency shall have an accountable process to ensure a meaningful and timely input to tribal officials in the development of regulatory policies that have tribal implications. Be accountable by, with prior tribal consent, recording and documenting all tribal meetings, including the invitations to be made part of the administrative record. Next slide, please. Secretarial Order 3398, which is titled Revocation of the Secretary's Orders Inconsistent with Protecting Public Health and the Environment and Restoring Science to Tackle Climate Crisis. We're in the long titles with these things. It revoked Secretarial Order 3389, which is titled Coordinating, as you can see on the slide, the first yellow bullet, Coordinating and Clarifying National Historic Preservation Act Section 106 reviews. The key point of the new Secretarial Order 3398 is to reverse the previous administration's policy so that compensatory mitigation is no longer disfavored or discouraged. As Matt indicated earlier, in short, offsite mitigation for no net loss is on its way back. The revocation may also mean that BLM will be evaluating which part of the 36 CFR 800 regulations to use for maximizing implementation of Section 106 process in conjunction with NEPA and consistency with BLM's National Programmatic Agreement. So SWCA and others may experience different uses by BLM of the 800 regulations for implementing the 106 process in conjunction with implementing the NEPA process. Secretarial Order 3398, which was issued on September 16th also had in it, within 60 days of this order, the Assistant Secretary shall submit to the Secretary a report listing each Bureau's office or office's policies, guidance documents, rules, and regulations that may warrant further action to be consistent with this Secretarial Order and Executive Order 13990. So stay tuned soon, because that's 60 days. It'll be up next week. Next slide, please. Concerning consultation, Secretarial Order 3399, which is titled Department-Wide Approach to Climate Crisis and Restoring Transparency and Integrity to the Decision-Making Process. As you may see on this slide, there are two of the guidelines on it. Proactive early engagement with environmental justice communities and tribes, and seek consideration of their interest in the decision-making process. Both of these are carrying forward what was emphasized out of that same Executive Order 13990's policy statement. Early application of the executive order has already shown up in a preliminary review by the Environmental Protection Agency for an interior agency's notice of preparation of an environmental assessment for a pipeline. Their letter indicates the EPA has identified the following key topics that we, EPA, recommend evaluating in the NEPA analysis so that the potential impacts to the public health and the environment can be fully understood. 1, groundwater and surface water resources. 2, greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. 3, environmental justice. 4, pipeline safety and spill response, getting back to the limit exposure. And 5, mitigation and control measures. Again, we'd have to look in this letter and recognize the influence of 13990 already being implemented. So as you may see, these executive orders and secretary orders present some direction on how the permitting landscape and agencies may be changing and reacting to the priorities and administrative actions of the Biden administration already. And I will be here to take questions later. So that's mine. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jim. Matt, I think we're going to turn to you to maybe kind of give us a summary on some of the trends we're seeing in the NEPA space.
Yeah. So I think one of the things, and we're gonna go a little bit out on a limb here and talk about, okay, so in terms of NEPA, what's here to stay, what may not be, et cetera, and what that means, particularly with EJ. And so this is a point where we can have a soothsaying looking forward. One, I think that it's safe to say that streamlining NEPA analysis is here to stay. Streamlining and was originally considered in the CQ regs. If you look at the CQ regs, those page limits and time frames in general were referenced early on. They just were not enacted because they didn't, as it went through the process of public involvement, people just didn't stick with them because it's very, very difficult. But I think over the past few years, based on Secretarial Order 3355, we have seen that streamlined NEPA can be done defensively. I think the specific page limits, the 150 page limits under 3355, may not be the case, but the limitations and the idea of streamlining NEPA, I think, is here to stay. And I think that it should be here to stay. People are going to be thinking along those lines. They're going to be thinking about how to do this in a reasonable time frame. The new CQ regs have a 2-year time frame, and how to do it defensively within that. So I think that will not change.
Matt, if I could just interject real quick, you referenced SO 3355, and that itself was revoked by 3398, along with a number of others, which I did answer one question in the Q&A that with a link to the full extent of 3398. But anyway, just your point is that although 3355 has been revoked, that all those sort of practices are here to stay.
In my opinion, yes. Even though you won't have the specific, okay, you're at 152 pages, pare it down, you will have the concept of, hey, we can do this quickly let's be looking on, let's invoke the same methods of doing it quickly that you were when you were operating under 3355. And the new CEQ regs will emphasize that as well. I think that in terms of environmental justice, there has actually been no substantive change in policy on environmental justice in terms of legal policy. What has changed is the emphasis, two things, in my opinion. The emphasis of, no, you will do this and you will consider environmental justice in your decisions. This is not just a check off the box. And secondly, climate is an environmental justice issue. I think those are two very, very big things that we should be paying attention to in terms of these executive orders we talked about. That means that we have increased input, increased outreach, and that the decisions that are made are actually going to consider input on scientific input related to climate and input on environmental justice that will actually change or influence those decisions, particularly social justice issues and indigenous tribal input. And so I think those are things to very much be paying attention to because those play right into the Department of Interior priorities we talked about earlier.
Thanks, Matt. Scott, do you want to hit on some of the highlights here, or trends we're seeing as it relates to the National Historic Preservation Act and/or Section 106? You're on mute, Scott.
I was on double mute, so
Yeah.
off of secret double mute. And so regarding the National Historic Preservation Act, no direct changes are currently proposed to that act or the compliance processes under Section 106 of the Act. The latest, greatest change is probably the retirement of the Executive Director of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, John Fowler, who had been in a leadership role there since 1997. And he's now replaced with Acting Director Reed Nelson. And it's unsure now whether the acting director will become the permanent director or if other changes will go on there. More so, the National Historic Preservation Act and Section 106 are experiencing indirect influences, and many of those indirect influences on the Section 106 process and practices are related to the same ones that NEPA is experiencing. That's in particular streamlining and the new emphasis or re-emphasis on environmental justice. The streamlining trend in particular requires greater integration and coordination of NEPA and Section 106. And for Section 106, that really means that, at least on large scale projects, we've been seeing more phasing of Section 106 reviews and more use of programmatic agreements to accomplish Section 106 compliance. And essentially that is for, in those streamlined processes, for Section 106 to be better synchronized with the NEPA decision-making order things, such as under FAST 41 and the FAST Act. And so Jim had mentioned Secretary Order 3389 earlier in relation particularly to mitigation, but in addition to the mitigation aspect of that order, it would have required the Department of Interior on their permitting processes to use NEPA substitution on the steps of Section 106. And that didn't get much momentum behind it. It was only passed last December before it was revoked by the current secretary. But regardless, it's always been good practice to integrate and coordinate NEPA and Section 106. And with the streamlining trend, it becomes more essential and less optional. The future direction and trends for Section 106 are also anticipated to be influenced by that current emphasis on environmental justice. And that includes the revisit of tribal consultation and strengthening nation-to-nation relationships that Jim had touched on earlier, and that President Biden put forth in a memorandum in January 2021. And overall, we expect to see a greater emphasis on federal trust responsibilities to sovereign native governments beyond environmental justice issues, and expect to hear more about treaty rights. And within this, we expect a greater expansion to whole sovereign nation interests beyond just Section 106 matters that have tended to receive a lot of attention in the past. And finally, we expect this to go beyond sovereign tribal nations to other environmental justice communities in consultation processes moving forward, including under Section 106, where these communities may not have previously been much involved. The Biden administration has doubled down, as we've been saying, on environmental justice initiatives. However, this may be the greatest area of uncertainty as agency implementation of those initiatives is being formulated. Joy and Meg will address practices that can be effectively applied to get in front of this while awaiting federal direction on the matters.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Yeah, I'm going to turn this over to Meg and Joy, but thank you, Jim, Matt, and Scott for kind of walking us through and setting the stage for some of the administration priorities, which I think couldn't be more clear, and how that, what those changes and trends are starting to look like. So with that in mind, we thought it'd be important to have some of our experts walk through some suggestions and best practices for community engagement. And then we'll go to the panel discussion and kind of think about integration of these practices within this ever-changing regulatory environment. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, ladies.
Thank you so much, Kara. And for everyone, just for your awareness, I am logging in today from Interior Alaska. I'm Koyukon Athabaskan, and my family is from several small villages along the Yukon River. So that kind of helps to, give a little bit of context of, my approach on stakeholder engagement and the different projects that I've worked on in the last 10 years of operating my business here in Alaska. And just to kind of, focus first and foremost on relationships. And that's kind of the underlying principle of what Meg and I are going to share is, not only, checking, as we mentioned before, checking the boxes, but going above and beyond that and building long-term positive relationships with environmental justice communities, tribes, rural areas around the country, and making sure that at the end of the day, people will welcome us back. I think that's a good strategy that regardless of what the regulations say on any given day, we want to have good relationships and get welcomed back in the future. And really, and that's kind of the focus of my work is communications and stakeholder engagement. My logo in the back is two circles interconnected because it's a reminder that, we're here to build relationships for the long term. And that just makes everything operate more smoothly. We want to be in the raft together, first and foremost, make sure we're all in this together, the communities, the agencies, the project proponents, and as consultants, it's our job to make sure we're in the raft together, because if we do, hit some turbulent class 4 rapids down the line, we'll get through them more smoothly and we'll be working together on that. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that here, but I wanted to hand it over to Meg and just emphasize that relationships is really the end goal. And so, in the future, growing up in rural Alaska, we have to work together in small communities. There may be different family dynamics, but at the end of the day, we do work together. And that's, I think, a principle that guides us here in the state that I try to bring to different projects as well. So I'll hand it over to Meg at this point.
Great, thanks, Joy, and greetings from the other side of the country here in my home state of North Carolina. So Joy and I are going to walk through 5 aspects of doing community engagement well, and we really want to encourage you to listen for at least one idea that you could take with you and start implementing right away in your work, understanding that community engagement for NEPA and Section 106 is already happening, even as we await instruction memos and guidance documents from the federal agencies. So we hope whatever your role might be, that you'll pick up something today that's useful to you right away.
And one other note on that is that there's a lot of different strategies and different ways to build relationships and to have quality, meaningful engagement with communities. So hopefully, in our presentation today, you might hear a few suggestions that you want to work with and maybe add to your toolbox. But there's a lot of different ways to reach that. And Meg and I are going to cover a few today. And if you have an open mind and you have, that long-term relationship as your objective, then I think there's a lot of different ways to get there. And we'll have some options for you today to consider.
Great. Next. All right, so listening and developing an understanding of who you're talking to is foundational to good community engagement. And we really encourage folks to start reaching out now so that you can develop relationships and gather information while there's still time to act on it. Often we think of engagement starting with scoping when it comes to NEPA, but look for opportunities before there's even a specific project on the table to start getting to know people. Conveying your genuine interest and desire to understand as you start engaging is really important. This could be things like your open body language when you're in a meeting with people, kind of bringing that warmth and friendliness and giving conversations your full attention, taking notes and showing people that you're taking things seriously really goes a long way. Practicing patience, as we all have to when we're in listening mode, and sitting back and avoiding interrupting and allowing for some pauses in the conversation for people to think. I think slowing down the pace to really take things in for yourself is important. Often some of us are in the position of coming in as outside experts. And so good reminder to myself and to all of us not to make assumptions. It's okay to not know everything. And so it's good to just ask if you're not familiar with something, and then listen actively to what community members will share with you. And listen even when you can't fix the problem. It's often the case that comments come up that are kind of out of scope or maybe outside your area of responsibility. And it's still important context for the conversation and the relationship that you're building. And so your willingness to hear that information that's being shared is really valuable. And finally, kind of demonstrating your good faith and that you really are learning by reflecting on your past efforts and what you've learned and implementing changes and really kind of making improvements along the way to show that you're really listening.
One example that I have on this is I did get hired by the Army Corps of Engineers here in Alaska to kind of look at their statewide outreach and relationships with the Alaska Native community and to give some really specific recommendations to them on improving those relationships. And again, not when there's necessarily a project on the table, but just throughout the entire year, and kind of making sure that they're doing maintenance on those relationships as well. And one of my suggestions was that the leadership of the Army Corps of Engineers here in Alaska attend an annual conference, the Alaska Federation of Natives Convention. And it's a 3-day conference where, a lot of different issues are discussed: public safety, public health of Alaska Native communities, and just to be participants and to listen, not in regards to any specific project, but just to get a better sense of the context and the issues that are important to the Alaska Native community would really help to position them for success. So when they do go, and also just to talk to people and kind of connect in a more informal way, I thought would be really, really, advantageous for them, as well as having a more regional approach with their project managers. So if you have different people coming to a community every few years for projects for one agency, they're kind of starting from the beginning every time. But if you have a regional PM that's going to be, serving that specific region of the state, of course, Alaska is very large with a lot of rural communities. There, you kind of build that familiarity, and you don't have to start the relationship from scratch every single time. So that was kind of another suggestion, and just making sure that your agency or your firm is kind of structured in a way where there are people that have the flexibility to pay attention and to visit communities and communicate proactively when there's not just related to a specific project. Because as we know, projects can bring a lot of different charge to them, and people may come to the table with a lot of concerns and maybe historic issues, which Meg's going to cover here in a minute, that it's not necessarily the best time to build a relationship, but you want to go out proactively and listen, as Meg said, to kind of what their issues are. Even if you don't necessarily have a solution in hand, it will build your relationship a lot stronger that way.
Great. So as Joy was mentioning, acknowledging history is really important. You might be arriving in a community for the first time, but the people who live there have been there for their whole lives potentially, and maybe many, many generations before that. So important to understand and keep in mind that the past continues to affect the present, and it's still relevant to whatever you're talking about with that community today. So I think taking it upon ourselves to learn some of the key points in the community's history before we engage, including things like past policies and projects and how they impacted the community, can be really important. And understanding what else walks into the room with you when you arrive. So in the particular setting with the historical context, whether it's your organization or agency or culture, I know that when I walk into the room as a white lady from the East Coast, there's a lot of, other things and assumptions and past history that walks in the door with me. And so acknowledging that, but not taking it personally, just understanding that that's part of the dynamic. And then being aware that the process you're leading or your presence might be connected to someone's personal or family history of violence, loss, and broken trust, and just being attentive to that and sensitive to it is really important.
And one really specific example that I have of this, I'm sure we've all experienced this in our lines of work and have probably dealt with it in different ways. It's kind of serendipitous. The picture up right now is of Old St. Joe's Church in Nome. And my example is actually a few communities surrounding Nome that I work with on a project, Teller and Brevig Mission. They were actually pretty much wiped out during the Spanish flu epidemic. And so, I wasn't aware of that at first, but I kind of learned that just recently. And it came up with the pandemic that we've actually been all getting through the last year here. And it came up last year that, whether or not our project would go out and hold community meetings, at some point during the pandemic, as things started to open up a little bit. And understanding the traumatic history and the impact of the Spanish flu. One of the elders in Brevig Mission was one of the few survivors, and she's living there now, and imagining just what her perspective might be, and how important it is that we recognize that and respect that, and not push them, into having a community meeting and to letting us come visit before things were very safe. And so that's just a more specific example of, kind of being aware of their history. And if you are, then you can navigate a lot more carefully and have, much better result. I think unintentionally, we sometimes aren't aware of things, and it's not, anyone's fault really. But if you take some time to learn a little bit more, then we'll have a much better representation there. I think next slide.
Great. So this maybe seems to go without saying. It's always good practice, but being respectful is important. And there's some specific ways that you can show respect when engaging with communities. First and foremost, with tribes and Native nations, recognizing tribal sovereignty by honoring different nations' approaches and protocols, building in ample time for government-to-government consultation, and remembering that that's a separate responsibility from Section 106 and NEPA public involvement. Keeping in mind that one person or group can't speak for others. You wouldn't turn to Chicago to tell you what New York City's interests are, and likewise, it's not appropriate to ask one tribe or community to speak on behalf of others. That's something that can be easy to fall into. Honoring local expertise and communities' knowledge of their own situation. There's more than one way to become an expert, and some of us go to school and others go to the school of life and spend lots of time in a particular place and have incredible local knowledge and experience that can be really, really important and valuable to these types of processes. Budgeting to compensate participants for their time and added costs. This is increasingly acknowledged as a best practice, and it recognizes the effort and the investment that's required to participate in these kind of involved processes like a NEPA involvement or Section 106, where there is time invested, and most of the other folks that are participating often are doing it as their job. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And then being sensitive to cumulative demands, including things like work, family, civic and cultural duties, particularly in small or overburdened communities. People wear many hats. And so just being sensitive to that, and also the history of how many other of these types of processes or demands on their time have happened, and how your requests may land in light of that. Next.
Just before I advance, everybody, I just want to do a time check here. We have about 15 minutes left, so.
Great, yep. All right, so quickly here then, being flexible. This is kind of a follow-on to listening and learning, really demonstrating that you are learning and planning for it. So building in to your work plan or your budget the time needed for an iterative process. So it's not just saying, oh, we'll figure it out as we go, but really building it into your project so that you have that time available and budget available to take input into consideration. And just generally starting a bit earlier and slowing down when it comes to community engagement is a good rule of thumb. Using the best communication avenues, venues, and schedule for the community. Adapt to local norms, reach out to your consulting parties and find out what the best way to involve them in that Section 106 process might be. And then an impact assessment, listening for and incorporating community perspectives on potential impacts to things like land, health, traditional practices that might not be part of your standard set of considerations. And exploring meaningful ways of integrating indigenous worldviews and traditional knowledge into impact assessment as well.
And two kind of quick examples on that. One is super easy. So if you're going out to a community, spend the night. It makes a world of difference. You'd be surprised how much better people will receive you if you're really taking the time to be there. It's like saying I visited Denver because I flew through the airport. People that live there would be like, yeah, right. You didn't eat there. You didn't sleep there. So taking the time to spend the night if you can will make a world of difference. I know it's not easy, especially when you have a lot of people flying out, but if you can make it work, it'll really make a big difference. And then being open to, what types of communication, avenues are really meaningful for the communities. And one example of that is I worked on a project for about 8 years, and it covered 2 different regions of our state. So there was Athabascans on one side and Inupiaq Eskimo communities on the other side, and they really wanted to talk to each other. And so, not only just visiting their communities individually, but at twice we actually brought both regions together and created a space where they can have like a 3 to 4 hour roundtable discussion between themselves. And that's what they really needed. That's what they wanted to do. And that was not in the original game plan. But once we realized that that was their preferred, way to kind of talk about this project, then, we made it happen. And so kind of being flexible, and that may mean that you shift a little bit midstream to respond to the communication avenues that will work best for them.
Great. And then finally, don't go this alone. Lean on resources. There's a lot you can draw on. First of all, the communities themselves. Getting back to that listening and learning. They're the best expert on their community, and local partners who have existing relationships can be really important to bring in on a project. Community engagement experts like Joy and myself, we're here to help. And within your own organization, finding colleagues who can kind of be your buddy or maybe a mentor that's a bit more experienced with community engagement, those are great people to seek out. And finally, of course, a wealth of organizations and trainings out there that are really great resources.
And one thing that I've done for projects in the past is just putting together a quick community profile. It seems simple enough, but you can access quite a bit of information online, and just putting it together and even putting pictures of the leadership and whatnot, so that when you land or arrive in that community, you at least have a baseline level of understanding and kind of a context for where you're at and what their issues are, and kind of their history and culture. I think that can be really helpful. And there's so many resources out there at your fingertips. A little bit of prep time in advance to put something like that together will definitely make your team feel more prepared, more comfortable, more confident in that situation.
Great. Next.
So I think kind of just wrapping up our section here, I think we've kind of hit on the fact that, it's important to focus on the relationships in and of themselves. And not only will you be making lifelong friends, hopefully, you'll also, bring so much more value to the project that you're working on. And I think something that we forget, and I even forget this, even though relationships is kind of my focus, is to really be open to bringing yourself to these discussions. And when I mean that, I mean your personal self, making sure that you're not just saying, my name is Joy and this is my title on this project, but this is who I actually am. This is where I'm from. And what I've done on projects is bringing our bios, printed copies of our bios, or sending bios in advance with photos. Even in the beginning of this presentation, you saw our photos, you kind of saw a little bit about who we were, but to bring that to a community and to give them that resource and to say, this is like where we're from, what our hobbies are, and pictures that aren't just headshots, but, a picture of you out, kind of camping or doing the things that you love with your family. That will, kind of create a more human face to these projects and to our agencies and our firms. And that's that's a really key ingredient. I mean, that's like the flour in the cake, is that we show up and we bring ourselves and we're willing to be open and accessible. And that's not always comfortable in these settings. And I think there's pressure to first and foremost represent the agency or represent the company and to leave ourselves out of it. But then you're not going to build a long-term relationship. And so being comfortable, really bringing yourself to the table, and then all the tools are going to be so much more effective, because you can only do so much without bringing kind of your personal, identity to the table, and a little bit of practice with that will definitely, it'll become more comfortable over time, and people, I think, will respond much differently when we're willing to do that.
Great. So we hope you found some things, pieces here and there in what Joy and I have just run through that are helpful to you in your work. And we encourage you to start taking small steps, and we welcome your questions and look forward to responding to them.
Thanks. I think what I'm hearing from Joy is that I should change my headshot to a picture of me pulling my hair out, parenting my child doing school at the dining room table the last year or so. That would be me for the last 12 months. So thanks, ladies. That was good stuff. I think now I want to kind of transition us, while we have a little bit of time left, to a panel discussion. And I really want to talk to the fellas and kind of get their perspective on, we talked about the regulatory setting and some of those trends. We've now talked about best practices for community engagement. And so, how can where's the integration piece? And so panelists, especially the fellas, I want you to keep some of those best practice ideas in your back pocket, as we transition to some of these questions. So the first one here, I wanted to ask, and maybe Matt, I'll start with you. What recommendations do you have for NEPA? I'll let Scott talk about 106. NEPA processes already underway, and how and to what extent do you see this guidance being integrated into projects that are in process?
Sorry, from my opinion, when you say, well, how much should we be integrating this? I say 100% right now. What everyone has been talking about is not a substantive change in the law. It's something that was mandated to be done before, but with this strong emphasis, you should be thinking about this right now. And what that means, if you already have a process going forward, is if you haven't had the outreach happening, do the outreach immediately. And I've worked on several NEPA projects where it's a question, okay, when do we do outreach? When do we start 106? And my answer from my standpoint is, in terms of community outreach, you do it immediately, right? Particularly with tribal outreach. And Joy and Meg brought up, this is all about long-term relationships, right? And the best way to start a long-term relationship is start talking as soon as possible, right? Because you can always bring out the project, do the description, bring out more information as it becomes available. The idea of, well, let's wait until we have something kind of locked in, I would not follow that. Outreach now as early as possible, even for your ongoing projects if it hasn't been done. And then look at how effective it is. Feedback. Are you having two-way communication? If you're not having two-way communication, it is not working. The old school, I'm going to be blunt, the old school of, well, I communicated, no one got back to me, so they must not care, is not valid, right? You need to ensure two-way communication. You need to bridge whatever divide that is, particularly because we're talking about EJ communities. There is a divide, right? So.
Thanks, Matt. Same question to you, Scott, kind of on the NHPA 106 side.
Well, for the section 106 part of things, tribal and native community engagement is always a big part of the existing requirements, but the trend has been towards these practices that Meg and Joy described. So, the Biden administration has gone back to listening sessions with tribal communities and nations for the executive branch agencies, and some of the results of that are coming through. Secretary Howland for the Department of Interior recently released their conclusions from that in a memorandum, and they're going to focus on consensus building, but the tools for that are really the things that Joy and Meg have gone through. And that's what we saw during the previous round of listening sessions and updates in the address of Executive Order 13175 that Jim earlier described under the Obama administration. And so regardless of some of the things that come out of current policy, the toolkit will be largely the same and will develop to support long-term engaged relationships and not necessarily just on a project basis, especially for agencies that are geographically located. But for agencies in industry, people who are not geographically fixed in their pursuits, there are a lot of them that have policies and approaches for becoming acquainted with communities they don't regularly work with. And for industry, that's increasingly been engaging with say, tribal governments and organizations, either early in the permit process before they even applied with an agency, or other ways to engage, independent of projects. So I'll leave it at that on this question.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Jim, I'm going to ask you a question actually that came in through the Q&A, which I think is sort of loosely related. And the question is, any ideas how to encourage agencies to do more to engage early and outside of these processes, right? Outside of Section 106 or outside of NEPA? How can folks sort of encourage that outside of NEPA, outside of process engagement?
Yeah, thanks, Carol. That's a good question because I think a lot of what's been emphasized early, as Matt hit on, and is how there's all to meet the 1-year timeline, basically, of notice of intent to a decision. There's the expectation now is to front load everything and but with the project and get the understanding and the analysis done up early to get it into the draft and let the public comment on. How do you go about that? Well, of course, there is the process under NEPA of doing public scoping, but I think under the circumstances, I would suggest with your question, and I'm not hearing this actually already being practiced, is where there are public workshops held, pre-scoping, if you would, to get some input in various communities, such as if you have on a transmission line, smaller rural communities, wherever they go across the state, to set up public workshops to have people come in and do a little bit of a preliminary explanation of what is the proposal, and then ask the public willing to attend there what their interest, what their concerns may be, what suggestions they have on the input. I think that gets at what Executive Order 13990 talked about, engaging and seeking public input on that. So public workshops prior to, quote, formal scoping, public scoping meetings would be a suggestion for that. The other thing you can pick up from just workshops would be, are there any environmental justice concerns in there? So it's just one of those tools right now that's having to be generated due to the upfront load demands needed to accomplish the task in being ready for the development of the EIS itself.
Yeah, thank you. I think shout out to the Bureau of Land Management in Nevada. They're the ones I think in particular you're referring to are doing some of those outside of process public workshops. So it'll be exciting to see how that feedback is integrated into the project.
Yes, kudos to them.
Absolutely. Well, we only have another couple minutes left here, and I want to wrap us up, but I think I'm going to just pose one more question to the panel, and maybe Meg or Joy, you could answer this one. I think it was a question clarifying one of your best practices about budgeting for community engagement. Could you help answer that question? I think it's a good one.
Joy, do you want to take this?
I mean, I think we can both probably take a stab at it. I mean, I definitely have experienced, community stakeholder engagement on a tight budget, and community stakeholder engagement on a more robust budget. And it definitely, I mean, I understand that some of the suggestions were throwing out there, including spending the night in a village, and really that we haven't said it directly, but that in-person communication. I mean, look at us now, we're kind of doing the Zoom so that we can reach a large audience and also have a diverse group of panelists. But in person, of course, is best. And we understand that there's going to have to be, and just like with all of these regulations that are pushing for more emphasis on engagement, early engagement, proactive, and being really responsive and inclusive, that's going to hopefully also mean that there's going to be bigger budgets for that particular aspect of the regulatory process. And if maybe we all have to push for that if you want us to do more proactive engagement, and even with the Army Corps of Engineers work, I knew that there was a budgetary connection to what I was proposing, because having people dedicated to just that maintenance of relationships, it's like, you plant a seed and you can't just walk away, it's not gonna grow. And so having to kind of come back and visit communities and be more engaged is going to take time. And that means having an ample budget for that. So just being aware of that is important. And like the meeting that I suggested where multiple communities came together, that was a significant investment to bring people together. It was chartered airplanes, it was hotel arrangements, it was catering, there was a lot to that. It was not as simple as just deciding to do it. So just like everything, investment, the more you invest in it, the more you're going to get out of it.
Thanks, ladies. And we're at time, so I'm going to wrap us up. And in fact, Scott, one of our esteemed panelists, had to run to another meeting. So thank you all, panelists and attendees. This was such a great discussion, and really just the beginning, I think, of the things that we're starting to see with this administration and how this might play out in permitting and in project work and in developing relationships, as Joy and Meg talked about. So thanks to those who've hung on for these couple minutes that we've gone over. As an attendee, you will receive an email with a link to the recording of this presentation. I know a number of you submitted questions that we did not get time to answer, and so we will definitely be following up with each of you. If you also, I'll just leave this up as folks drop off. But if you have questions and you'd like to reach out individually to any of the panelists or Matt or I'll leave this slide up with our contact information, and we're happy to hear from you and answer any questions you might not have put in the Q&A or heard us talk about today. So thank you again for your time, and I'll just leave this up for another minute and then we'll close it out. Thank you.